Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Thank you so much for bringing me here. The first things I'm going to do is I see some people in the back. If you want to come and sit, I see. If you have a seat next to you that's empty, can you raise your hand so people know? If you want to, no obligation. If you want to stand up, that's great also. Okay, get this started. So, my name is Julián Delgado Lopera. I landed last night from San Francisco. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to everybody at UMBC for bringing me. Thank you to all the students who read the book. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much, Courtney, for all the work that you've done and bringing me here. So the talk for today is called The Sounds of El Futuro. And it's basically the making of Fiore Tropical, which is my first novel, and it's the book that some folks read. And this is going to cover a little bit around oral traditions, spoken word, language that is usually kind of discarded and not used for literature. And in a way, the lecture is on my deep love for storytelling and the many questions that I've had to ask myself in kind of my journey as a writer, especially writing in a tongue that is not native to me. I'm originally from Colombia. So some of these questions that are informing this include, why am I so obsessed with the way that people speak? And how can I channel this obsession into my writing? What is the relationship between kind of orality and textuality? Is it okay for me to be bringing Spanish into my English? And how can I bring kind of my Latin American storytelling DNA into my writing? So these are just kind of some of the questions that are informing the talk. So we're going to start from the beginning. This is a picture of my mom and my tias. And my love for storytelling very much begins kind of at 5 p.m. on Saturdays in Bogota at my abuela's dining room at a table full of loud and unstoppable women. So my 5 aunts plus my mom's 5 aunts will all be smoking, some in their bras, some in their rulos. They would all be telling stories of heartbreak or revenge or the rising prices at the grocery store. Very good Colombians, we use a lot of grand gestures to tell stories. So some of my tias will be pointing with their mouths. Others will be making up words. Some of them will be yelling. Some of them will be crying. So there were a lot of them narrating a very similar experience, but each one put her own twist to her story. Each one kind of spoke with a different word choice and a different rhythm. So this right here, kind of like my grandmother's dining table is my introduction to storytelling. Like I said, I'm originally from Bogota, Colombia. And my most formative years as a storytelling began at this dining table. I grew up in a matriarchy. There were 5 aunts, and then the great aunts who will come from Cartagena will stay with us too. And so I was usually in awe at the ways that my tias talked and told stories. I was really fascinated by the way that they use language. In this case, it would be Spanish. They would just mix a lot of words and create new ones, and it was just really fascinating to me. So some of the things that they did. My mom, for instance, will complain in silence and just sigh deeply. My tia Te would be cursing all the time. She'd be like, "Atari, hijo de su madre." And then my other aunt would just be always talking to God, being like, "What is wrong with this man?" And as a kid, I just sat among them in awe, so marveled at how expansive, how elastic, how very infinite language felt and very fun. If my aunts didn't know a word, they would just make it up and laugh about it. And in retrospect, I now know that I wasn't only enamored by the way that they spoke, but I was also just really enamored by their performance of the language. The performance was as important as the things that they were saying. So, the gesturing, the silence, the eye rolling, the eye shotting, the hands, I wanted to bottle up all that energy. And then there was the layering of the stories in the family, which really helps with plot. So there were so many secrets. Anybody comes from a family of secrets? Yes, okay. Yeah, a lot of secrets. And I can't tell you how many times one of my tias will pull me aside and be like, "Okay, I'm going to tell you something that is very important. And you can't tell anyone, promise?" And I'll be like, "Okay, who knows?" And said tia will be like, "Well, your tia M told me and said not to say anything, but I trust you." So I didn't grow up around books, but I grew up around a lot of sad women that were incredible storytellers and magicians with language and layered secrets and plot. And I was not once bored in their presence. Was not a family of writers or big readers, but it was a family of talkers and of things that were really bad for life but good for fiction, aka trauma. Okay, so this is a little map of dialects of Colombia. And, like I said, my family is originally from Cartagena. And I'm just going to point out what that is. So Cartagena is like around here. And they speak costeño. And I was born here. So I am speaking Rolo. So, my family is originally from Cartagena, which is the coast of Colombia, a region that is known for kind of its magnificent storytellers, its grand words, a region where made up words are kind of the norm and where music and rhythm are very much essential to speaking. This is also where the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez is born, and it's from and where he got a lot of his influence in his books. So the language at the dining table with my tias, in Bogota, where I'm growing up, it's already mixed from two different regions. The Caribbean coastal Spanish of the coast, which is costeño, and then the Rolo Spanish, which is the Andean kind of Spanish. And we used to travel to Cartagena to visit my family there, and I was just also deeply fascinated by the way that my great aunts taught. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit so you can hear it. If you don't speak Spanish, you can hear very much how different they talk. So my aunt from Cartagena will say, ajá, pedazo de pelada, ven pa' acá. My tias in Bogota would say, mija, ven para acá, buenos días. So very different. So I kind of inherited, so this kind of makes this already happening in my life because I have, both the Rolo and the Costeño happening. And, I kind of inherited this creative tongue from my aunts. And in Colombia, I was a very loud, energized talker. I wouldn't shut up. I was making up words too. And I was really good at writing in school. Now, I'm going to make a pause and be a little bit of a stereotype, but I have to talk about telenovelas. And, it's Hispanic Heritage Month, so hello. I did grow up on telenovelas and salsa. That's just the reality of the situation. And I wanted to make some space here because I really learned so much about dramatic tension from telenovelas, Part of my world as a child was this. I watched them every day. And, as a child, the bus from school would drop me off at my abuela's house, and I would just run up her building and knock on the door. My grandmother would open the door, and I would say, la novela, abuela, and she'd be like, la novela, Mimi. And so we would run to her room, and she would turn on the TV, and we would sing together the opening to Dos Mujeres, Un Camino. And so, the telenovelas were bringing that pain about life to another dimension for me, that pain that I saw in my tias. There was something really painful about being a woman. And the telenovelas really embodied that. And they taught me so much about rising tension and plot. Right? So again, no, not books, telenovelas and my tias. And before I move to my other life, which happens in the US, I just want to mention Bogota because plays has so much to do with the development of my linguistic development, basically. It's so crucial. Plays has been such a crucial part of my relationship to language. And it may be obvious, but Bogota lives very much inside me. These are some pictures that I took there. I was there in December and in June. And if you speak Spanish, it's great. If you don't, I can translate some for you. Me voy a morir de tanto amor, I'm gonna die from so much love. This one is a comer y a disfrutar mi amigo el pollo rey de la Navidad. It's like my friend, the chicken king of Christmas, which is just a really funny way of getting you to go buy the chicken. La consentida y the spoiled one, just in somebody's truck. So a lot of people ask me about the voice of the narrator in Fiebre Tropical and how that voice was developed. And there's a lot of influences in it for sure, and I'm going to be touching upon a bunch of them. And this one is one of them. There is this thing that happens in the streets of Bogota where people are trying to get you to buy things. And so you're on the streets and everybody's like, mi reina, ven para acá, te voy a dar una cosita. And it's like, so people are trying to lure you in into buying. And the way that they lure you in is by calling you my queen, my princess, come here, And so when you read the book, the narrator is addressing the reader as mi reina and is doing this kind of breaking this fourth wall. And the breaking of the fourth wall is something I learned from the place where I'm from. So this is me at 15. And this is a week before I moved to the US. And I just found that picture and wanted to put it there. So I'm 15 years old and I moved to the US. So the moment that I moved to the US and landed in Miami, a lot of that love and energy for language disappeared. And it was here in Miami, specifically in Florida, that I had my first encounter with language hierarchy. I was 15 years old and we were reading Romeo and Juliet in English class. I begged and prayed that I wouldn't be called to read Juliet's part because it was long and I didn't know what most of the words meant. But of course I was called to read Juliet's part. My heart sank. When I said I didn't want to, the teacher responded that I would lose participation points if I didn't. So okay, I had to read it. I tried to push my tongue in impossible ways. I tried to echo the sounds that I had been hearing around me, but I butchered all the words. And everyone around me just laughed. The teacher just stood there silently. I clenched the desk, wanting to disappear, wishing to be made small, invisible. So I share this memory because, and I put it all up there, because it was a very big turning point for me after kind of having this really like fascinating life with language. And of course, now I only know in retrospect, not while I was living it, but I was having this relationship with it. And then all of a sudden I moved to the US and things really shift. And in the school specifically, things really, really shift for me. Until now I'm having my entire life happening in Spanish, and then I have to come here and learn another language. And I used to have this really fun relationship to language, but the school in Florida really sucked it dry. And I went home this day and told my mom that I wasn't going to go back to school. The laughter and the ridicule at school had created such a deep fear and anxiety inside me. I spoke differently, and this clearly was wrong. And it wasn't only me who was being laughed at and corrected. I watched my teachers correct some of my peers, usually anybody who wasn't white, shaming immigrant kids for saying things like quota instead of quarter, la pinadora instead of peanut butter, Thanksgiving instead of Thanksgiving. So it seemed that a lot of us were crossing this kind of invisible language boundary, a boundary that was policed by the teacher and maintained by the students' laughter. So in English class, what I started to do was I started writing my essays phonetically in Spanish so that I could read them out loud without panicking. I pretended to understand what people said, what words meant, but really the correct English, the English taught in schools, the English that has been institutionalized as the standard one, felt very inaccessible to me. So it really saddened me that I couldn't access that part of myself that was so excited about language, right? Because my way of speaking with an accent or pronouncing things in Spanish as I heard them or mixing Spanish into my English was deemed wrong. Okay, and yet, this is my Miami mood board. Pesado Gigante, Tostones, and Goya. There's more to Miami, of course. This is very, very reductive. So Miami, and Miami. So all of this stuff is happening in the school, but yet on the streets of Miami, at the Cuban grocery store with my mom, at the hair salon, and again at my grandmother's dining table that appears again, but now in Miami, a very different type of English was kind of emerging and being spoken. It was in these places where I first encountered this mix of English and Spanish, aka Spanglish. It was in these places, again, that language took on another shape, a more playful one that didn't have any rigid boundaries. So it was very different from what was happening at school with me. Here, in all these different spaces, like English and Spanish were not mutually exclusive. They didn't live as like two separate languages, but rather kind of open circle to touch each other. We didn't really know where one ended and the other one began, and it didn't really matter because that's how we lived. So again, the dining table appears again, and this time is in Miami, not in Bogota. And this time the language is kind of a dominant of Spanish with drops of the English my tias, my mom and myself and my grandmother are learning from the TV, the neighbors, and the street. And the way that the women in the family and like the way that I'm learning English has so much to do with sound, and it has so much to do with listening. So when we don't know a word in English, for instance, we will make it up by using the Spanish word and adding tion, Tion, at the end. So for instance, my tia Ted says when she's very annoyed, uy, what a jodation. Joder is bothering. What a jodation, literally the translation from Spanish is que ganas de joder. That's what we do. So in the little dollar store notebook that my grandmother buys me, I'm in the corner, listening to all of them talk. And I'm just writing down all these inventions because I think they're incredible and they're delicious. And when they say them, something really feels alive inside me. I don't know what it is, but I just like toss it around and write it down because it just feels so delicious. And so this kind of like this bastard tongue that is like Spanglish starts becoming the center of my own linguistic experience. These are some examples, very simple. Give me the trapo, I have to planche it. Mom wants her chanclas. Oye, ¿estás ready? So Spanglish is a form of storytelling that lives in the air. It's an oral form on the streets and has roots all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. Spanglish is unconcerned with the white gaze. It throws the correct English and the correct Spanish grammar book out of the window and kind of builds one for itself. One that is playful, imaginative, brilliant, and limitless. There's no class in Spanglish, not that I know of. Maybe people study Spanglish, but to learn it, you kind of have to develop an ear for it, right? You need to spend so much time listening, kind of living at this linguistic crossroads. And it's also not static or uniform. Depending on where you are, it shifts. So if you go to New York, there's one. If you go to Miami, there's other. Houston, LA. Depending on also the relationship that each immigrant group has to the land where they are. So in Miami was when I first heard Te llamo pa' atrás, which is I call you back, literally translated to Spanish. And in LA was the first time that I heard Ay te guacho. For your delight, these are some Spanglish words that I put together with my friends. I'll just read some. Textear, la troca, flipear, a webs, I love a webs. Stoqueo, el shopping, googlear, bro, a los biles, the one, tripear, cliquear, hangueo, updatear, fuchi face, barquear. La hot mess. That's right, la hot mess is right there. El shopping. What else is there? Chequealo. Okay, so I want to take a little bit of a step back, and this is my, I like looking at things in graphs also. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and see what's really happening here with language. We tend to think of language, and in this case, English, as a closed circle where all of us English speakers exist. A closed circle where what we call correct English is kind of elevated at the center. When someone says something in another language, we know it's kind of outside of the circle. When someone speaks English with an accent or without proper grammar, meaning they don't speak correct English, it is inside the circle, but not correct, so not at the center. So we push both the language and the people who speak it to the margins, and that's the dotted liminal line. So what we really don't consider is how treating language as a closed circle, as having rigid boundaries with a solid center, excludes so many people, so many ways of speaking, but also so many ways of telling stories and so many ways of thinking about craft. How this center creates a hierarchy of language and how, in turn, this hierarchy is racialized. The English that I was taught in school, the grammar that I was constantly messing up was white English. This standard English has linguistic legitimacy. We see it spoken and written everywhere, particularly in formal settings like politics and journalism, while the English I heard on the streets of Miami, spoken by Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Venezuelans, and every other immigrant group, is kind of pushed aside, disregarded, and treated as less than, not real English and not good English. So this mixture of English, spoken with other languages, and this, in my case, Spanish, is therefore discarded, which is that little circle right there. And discarded language rarely makes it to literature. So yes, we can speak Spanglish with your abuelita. Yes, we can have shops with names like, a Sandrita Lavanderia, Julio's Tacos, or Shakira can drop a few words in Spanish on the TV. We are allowed this non-threatening, unregulated spaces. But try writing a story in Spanglish and watch people flip. This is a lot of what happened to me trying to publish this book. Because this hierarchy permeates literature and writing. If literature is the high art of language, Spanglish, this kind of discarded, illegitimate spoken language, can never be real literature. And yet, it is in this liminal space outside of correct English and correct Spanish, this kind of boundless space where Spanglish exists, where a lot of immigrant language also exists, that is ripe for a multilingual poetics and for really an expansion of craft and an understanding of story. This is also the space where I have spent the last 20 years, which is the 20 years that I've lived in the US. And it is the space that is the most interesting and exciting to me in terms of like language, and the space that I feel is like ripe for storytelling. And it's also in the space, that dotted line, that like Fiebre Tropical kind of is born. So it said some of this. If Spanglish is wrong instead of white English is correct, and who's being understood, and whose world is called into life. So Spanglish is not perceived as legitimate because it is not legible to whiteness, period. Spanglish is unconcerned with the white gaze. Like I said, it throws a white grammar book out of the window and builds one for itself, one that is playful, imaginative, brilliant, and limitless, one that is concerned with creative expression and rhythm. Spanglish doesn't look outside. It doesn't react to whiteness, but rather looks inside itself for the linguistic tools it already has and shapes them. It takes a mother tongue, Spanish, and by mixing it and matching it, by embellishing it with English, it turns it into a drag queen. Spanglish. I know, the queerness is coming, just wait for it. You can see it coming. Okay, I had to use Bad Bunny. At some point, you have to drop in. Yeah, this kind of liminal space outside of this like rigid borders place of language is really much about just like diving into the unknown, and you kind of like open up space for like different forms of storytelling. What really happens when Spanish is mixed with English is that the storytelling structures that are possible in Spanish that are seeped in Latin American culture are kind of shaping this new format being brought in. And in this way, we can reimagine the language that we use for stories, but also the craft behind storytelling, because it has incorporated linguistic elements from like multiple languages, right? It also brings questions around language purity, like who makes these rules and where does each language end? And can we create new forms of expressions, of poetic forms and expressions that transcend linguistic and cultural boundaries? So using Spanglish, and again, I'm thinking about this from a very like craft point of view around how to bring in story, how to craft stories differently. Why do we understand creative writing and like writing the way that we do? And so using Spanglish in American literature brings Latin American linguistic codes and storytelling structures into the English language, decolonizing and undermining Western's literary craft expectations and exposing the racial hierarchies inherent in correct English, bringing a future of craft created by immigrant diasporic languages to the now. So the future is marica and in Spanglish. Oh my God. And by this, I mean something, I'll just give you a very quick example of this. There is this writer called Maribel Moreno, who never got as much attention as all the other boomers because she was a woman, Latin American boomers because she was a woman. And she wrote this whole book that is basically all expository writing. It doesn't have a lot of scenes. And so when I'm thinking about how do you bring in stuff from a different culture, from a different language into writing, that is what I mean. In like Western craft, you very much write stories through scene. You write one scene after another scene very much. I mean, there's more to it, but that's how you can write it. And so what Maribel does is just like, no, I'm just going to write expository writing. So for me, it was like, well, what if I just bring in expository writing and write, like, can you write a whole book to it with it too? What does that do if you bring that kind of stuff into English? That's the stuff that I'm thinking about around craft. Here's another example. I'm going to contártelo todo, and this actually happens through text messages. I'm going to contártelo todo when I see you. Cabrona toda mi hora. No, oh my God, what a hallucination. And these are two that I got while doing some of these talks around. Tomate un Selfish was from the West Coast. Mentally and Sue was Miami. There's actually a website called metelinsu.com. I know, I love it. Okay, so now we're gonna get to the gay stuff. Of course, I heard a yes. Yeah. I mean, it's always gay because I'm here telling you this, but I want to point to kind of another layer of linguistic influence in my life that makes it into Futuro Tropical, which is queer language and queer culture and queer life, which has been an essential part of my life for the past 17 years. And this right here is a picture of Esta Noche, which was a bar that opened in 1973 and closed 8 years ago in San Francisco. And it was kind of like where I landed when I got to San Francisco, was at this bar. And by landed, I mean I literally landed there. So I'm a big homosexual, in case you can't tell. And I hang out with a lot of drag queens. I have a trans mother that's from Cuba, who arrived in San Francisco in the 1980s. I have a very big queer family. A lot of them are immigrants that got to the US in the 80s. So the way that I entered San Francisco is twofold. One, my best friend was a drag queen at this bar called Esta Noche, which is this one, and I was his assistant. And I spent a lot of time in this kind of dungeon down the stairs with all these queens helping him do his padding and his hair and just listening to them bitch and talk. And there were all these Latino queens who were getting ready for pageants. So that's one. And then the second is I was adopted by Adela Vasquez, who's my trans mother. She's been my mother for 13 years after I kind of fled the homophobia in my household and landed in San Francisco. And so I also get the queer Spanglish that is happening in her house, which is a more old school queer language. When I go to her house to kind of eat harina de maíz and frijoles and stuff like that, we're watching Caso Cerrado. Okay, yeah, some Caso Cerrado fans, okay. And we're watching Caso Cerrado, eating frijoles, and just kind of like I'm listening to her talk. So there's this kind of older queer language. She's been in the US for 30 years. And then the more younger, the past, 17 years of my life. This is just a really pretty picture of Esta Noche in the early 1990s. So again, I enter through the queer bar, and queer language explodes for me, right? So I already have this kind of like Spanglish base that I'm coming with from Miami, and then I come to San Francisco, and something really comes to life for me at the nightclub and at nightlife. Which is just language really popping off the stage and off the dance floor. I mean, queer people have been inventing new language to kind of like represent our bodies and our realities. We already know that, and we've just been like playing and bending language a lot. So these are some words that have stood out for me. Sisi Marica, Fierce, Perra, Butch Puppy. This is my trans mom and her friend Tina in the late 80s getting ready for a night out. So what happens with drag queens is that they don't have to be grammatically correct. Drag queens don't care about grammar. They just want to be campy and sassy and quick. And so I'm entering this bar and I'm watching a queen who has an audience of people that are both monolingual speakers or second generation who don't speak a lot of Spanish. And she has to figure out how to get everybody to understand what she's trying to say. And the way that she does it is just by being funny and switching back and forth and making up words. Some of the stuff that I'm putting out there, like Butch Puppy. I love Butch Puppy. So drag queens really taught me how to embody a story on stage. I wanted my writing to do what I saw drag queens were doing on stage. I was like, how do I do that? How do I make my writing kind of like pop so much? And I would just go and watch them talk and watch them kind of like piece together a story. I mean, they're piecing together a story on stage. If you're watching a drag queen not on YouTube, but live, they kind of piece together a story. So what I started doing was like I started doing my face and just showing up at readings all done. And I started kind of borrowing elements of drag into performance and into stage for like my work. And like I said, drag, like a story, is about inhabiting a different consciousness, right? You're kind of creating a whole new character, you're dressing up, you're playing, and there's so much of this kind of playfulness that I wanted to bring into the way that I was approaching storytelling. This is a picture of me about to go on stage at the Stud Bar that also closed during the pandemic, as I was about to tell stories. Okay, so this is just language at work. This is just like a very simple example of how things are created. And so queen, reina, queen in Spanish. The obvious, result is that. And so queena, I heard it the first time in Esta Noche also from stage from a queen. And it has just like stuck around. So this one is one of my favorite writers, Pedro Lemebel. I don't know if anybody knows him. Yes, okay, some people know him. Great. I love Pedro Lemebel so much. And Pedro Lemebel, so this quote is, I could write simply, pero tengo la lengua salada. I could write simply, but my tongue is salty. And I feel very seen by this quote in writing and in life, because Pedro was very much about bringing this like kind of like homosexual poetics into his writing and doing this writing that was very rococo, very over the top. He was very unapologetic about that. Very political, very openly sexual, and extremely unapologetic about it. As you can see, his beautiful face right there. So what all of this kind of has in common and what I'm trying to point at is that what has happened for me in even creating this book, but just a lot of my writing life has been about being able to notice all these things that really feel alive to me about language that kind of exists in a non-traditional way, right? I love books. I read a lot. I do. I think that you should still be reading. And there are all these other ways in which language has like kind of come up for me. And the only way that I have kind of chased that was through paying attention. So I had so much to do with just actually being able to just pay attention to the things that feel really alive inside me, including my aunts talking shit at the dining. Can I say shit? My aunts talking shit at the dining table. The Cuban grocery store, the hair salon, the drag queens at the bar, like all those different ways in which language just felt alive to me in a way that felt like non-traditional to literature, but I still kind of chased them for some reason. And so I wanted to just read this poem really quick about noticing. So everything that you notice is important. Let me say that a different way. If you notice something, it is because it is important, but what you notice depends on what you allow yourself to notice, and that depends on what you feel authorized, permitted to notice in a world where we're trained to disregard our perceptions. So I kind of just like follow some things that I felt very obsessed by in the writing of this book, especially with language. Even though I was told many times that I couldn't write in a certain way, that I couldn't be mixing the languages, that like so many things where I was being told not to. But there was something really that was pulling me so much about this kind of textured language and something just about, kind of the things that I was noticing that felt really important. So some of these questions that I guess I also just want to leave you with is like, what do you notice? What do we disregard? Is there a type of relationship to language that I've been avoiding? What is your linguistic DNA? Who are those that have paved the way for you? So for me, that's also why I put Pedro Lemebel in there. And so I wanted to end in terms of noticing with just two quotes. This is from Jose Esteban Munoz. The ornamental language that breaks out of the Ecuadorian uniformity sparks something. So thinking about what is that spark in you? What is the spark? That's something that like kind of breaks out of the Ecuadorian uniformity of everydayness. What is that for you? And lastly, we understand our lives are tried to by the stories we tell. Okay. We're gonna go to questions, but I'm gonna read first. And I need some water because I've been talking nonstop. I mean, I just made a whole thing about how much I like talking because my aunts like it. Okay, let's do it. You guys ready? Yeah. Okay. Y dice, chapter 1. I'll just start from the beginning. Buenos días, mi reina. Immigrant criolla here reporting desde los Miamis from our ant-infested townhouse. The broker air conditioner above the TV, the flowery couch, La Tata half-drunk directing in this holy radionovela brought to you by Female Sadness Incorporated. That morning, as we unpacked the last of our bags, we found Tata's old radio. So the two of us practiced our latest melodrama in the living room, while on the TV, Don Francisco saluted El Pueblo de Miami, damas y caballeros. And Tata, at her age, to Mami's exasperation, my delight, went girl crazy over his manly voice. Y como quien no quiere la cosa, Mami angrily turned out the stove where la Tata had left the bacalao frying unattended. Then Lysol sprayed the countertops, smashing the dark trail of ants hustling some pancito for their colony behind the fridge. Girlfriend was pissed. She hadn't come to the US of A to kill ants and smell like puto pescado. And how lovely would it have been if the housekeeper could have joined us on the plane. Then Mommy could leave her to the household duties and concentrate on the execution of this migration project. Pero aló, is she the only person awake in esta berraca casa? On the TV, another commercial for Inglés sin barreras. And Lucia, la Tata, and I chuckled at the white people teaching brown people how to say, hello, my name is. Hello, I am going to the store. Hello, what is this swamp? Please come rescue us. It was April and hot. Now that the heat dissipated in June or July or August or September or even November for that matter. The heat, I will come to learn the hard way, is a constant in Miami. El calorcito didn't get the impermanence memo, didn't understand how change works. The heat is a stubborn bitch, breathing its humid mouth on your every pore, reminding you this hell is inescapable and in another language. We've been here for a month, newly arrived, still saladitas, and I already wanted to go back home to Colombia, return to my panela land, its mountains, and that anxiety that comes just from living in Bogota. That anxiety that I nonetheless understood better than this new terrifying one. But Mommy explained to me over and over again with a smirk that, look around you, Francisca, this is your home now. Our to-do list that doomed Saturday of the ants and the bacalao included helping Mommy with the preparations for the celebration of her miscarried dead baby, Sebastian. It had been argued by the only people who cared to argue, La Tata and her hermanas, that my dead brother's baptism was the most exciting event in the Martinez Juan family that year. This mainly because La Tata drank half a bottle of rum a day, couldn't tell Monday from Friday, so obviously a fake baby's baptism at a pastor's pool was more important to her to say than the fact that by the end of the month, my younger sister, Lucia, was regularly praying over me, or the fact that I would eventually remember this time, the first months after our arrival, as Mommy's most sane, grounded moment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, cachaco. Primero la primaria. I'll stop there. Thank you. So I was told that we're doing Q&A. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, I have, personally, I have an interest in writing characters speaking in their own languages. Like this one character in my mind speaks a lot in Chinese, but no puedo escribir o habla en todas lenguas. A shortcut that I've seen is like people just translate it into English and like just tell that it's in another that's actually in another language. What's your stance on that part?
Translating?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. But I think that there depends on the story that you're telling. You know, I think that so there's something that happens with Spanish, and I think that it has a little bit of an advantage sometimes over other languages because Latin America is just kind of right there, and there's like 50 million of us here. You know, and like Univision is like the biggest like channel or something in the US. So I do think that Spanish has a little bit of an advantage. We also have the same alphabet. So things are written in the same alphabet. So I've had people ask me these questions about using other languages and how to do that. And I think that the best way to do that is like who has come before you and how have they done it. I don't have all the answers to all the languages. I think that if you're interested in using a different language or in using more translation is like looking at the way that like writers have done that before you and how have they handled it. I know of people who put things in italics. I know of people who put things, who translate things. I am kind of treating Spanglish as its own like linguistic phenomenon. I'm not treating it as like the Spanish and English being different on the page. It has way more English than Spanish. If I wrote it fully bilingual, I think that's a different kind of intention for the story. But I'm treating Spanglish as its own thing. So not really separating both languages in there. Thank you. Yes, hi.
Hi. Can you...
Sure.
So when I hear you, thank you so much for this presentation, by the way. When I hear you talk about your experience with your aunts and the orality, the first thing I think of is our Africanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of Miami, for me, Miami is a very Caribbean place. Mm-hmm. And just thinking of folks in Cuba, Puerto Rico, that identify very much with Caribbeanness.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about the Caribbean, including the Caribbean, they're known for speaking bad Spanish,
mm-hmm.
right? And so there's this tension between identifying with being Latin American and identifying with being Caribbean,
mm-hmm.
because of the whole question of Caribbeanness being associated with Blackness, mm-hmm. and the bad Spanish speakers being associated with speaking bad Spanish because of the heavy African influence.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Is that something that and I'm looking forward to read the book. I haven't read it yet, but is that something that has come up for you in your work in terms of thinking about these connections with the way in which Black folks have this history of being, as we might say, creative with language and fearless with language, particularly colonial languages,
yeah.
and the Caribbean, especially Caribbean Spanish, being one of those places where people have just taken this language and just always done something with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, Spanish is a colonial language too, right? So I'm specifically focusing on English here and kind of, drawing out a lot of the hierarchies that exist in English. But if you go into Spanish, it's not the same thing, but very similar, right? It also is very racialized. It also, the Spanish that is kind of held at the center has so much to do with light-skinnedness and class. So I think that Spanish itself, and probably Portuguese was also good. I put it there. Somebody was talking about Arabic having similar. So I think that every single language is going to have its own kind of model. I mean, I don't know all the languages, but Spanish specifically is going to have that, And so all I'd say is I'm thinking about, people who are bringing in, writers from the Caribbean who are also just bringing in other ways of shifting language in there. I think that is also the same thing that I'm talking about is going to apply to how the anti-Blackness of Latin America and Spanish. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking just about, The Streets of Love's Footsteps. I don't know if you read that book. It's by a Haitian writer. And just in the ways that there are writers in the Caribbean who are kind of breaking with some of that too. But yeah, definitely it is kind of very prevalent in Spanish as well. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Gracias, Julián.
Do you want that?
I can use it next. Gracias. I think just your talking and work is just really special in terms of thinking about just everyday spaces as creative spaces outside of really formal university learning spaces. And following your path, you mentioned very briefly that it also made you had roadblocks in publishing and getting the work out there. And I wanted to give an opportunity if you wanted to speak to that, but also what advice would you give to folks, not just in writing, but in other creative spaces that are going to follow roadblocks by wanting to do what they want to do, or treating the craft in the way that they feel they want to treat the craft, or building a whole new value system for their craft. And they're going to reach those roadblocks that are telling them that that's just not the way you're supposed to do it. What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this a little bit when I was talking about the hierarchies, and it was a challenge to find people that wanted to publish the book. And I got a lot of coded like anxieties around the language, just like, things that to me were just like very coded in kind of like xenophobic anxieties. And I also, through workshopping the parts of the book, I had a lot of challenge in group settings where, people were not talking about the craft specifically about the book, but just how Spanish was not written for them, or like how the book was not for them. And so, that was like challenging for me, because I was like, okay, but like I want to hear, what about the craft? Like, it's just that's not what I'm here for. So that was challenging. I think that the way that I dealt with a lot of that, like, was by paying attention. Like, it was definitely upsetting. But I think that I also come from a place of having such a strong self of culture, that I was like, okay, well, they don't get it. Like I didn't fully internalize it, which was good. But I do think that a lot of people can internalize a lot of that fully and then not write the way that they want to, because they're being told that they shouldn't. And I think that just like what I started to do was just like hearing the people that were actually interested in the vision that I had for my work. So like, okay, people would say some things and I was like, okay, you don't get it. And it wasn't that I was open to feedback. It was not that. And so the people that were actually providing me feedback and challenging me in the ways that I was like, oh, you actually understand the vision for this work, then I'll pay more attention to that. And I just would suggest doing that. It's like being open to feedback and like listening to like what people are saying, but also not everybody's going to get what you're doing. And people are just like very different, like, I don't know, moments in their whatever. Like, they're just, a lot of people are not going to get what you're doing. And so I think just like really getting the people who do understand your work closer to you and bringing in those folks and kind of like working with that, I think. And also just like starting the things that you want to see. I have started many different things in San Francisco because of the things that I wanted to see for myself in the work. Like, if you don't see it, then like you can start it, just like get your friend and be like, okay, I want to see this stuff. And by that, like I have right now a project with a really close friend of mine called Memoria TransSF, which is a project where we're building all these queer history projects in San Francisco that specifically address Latinx history of the city. And so, we're just like, we're not seeing all of this like trans history being told. It's just like start doing our work here. So that's the things that I would say is just like, look for the people who really see the vision of your work. I know it's really hard to not internalize people's things all the time. That's just like maybe some labor that you have to do on your own of like, just like figuring out how to not internalize everything. And then just like, being able to just like focus on the people who are actually getting what you're trying to do and that are challenging you in ways that feel generative to your work. And then just like starting things that you want to see. Like, if you want to have a writing group with a bunch of like POC people, then like get a bunch of your friends and then post it online and then get them to start writing, maybe do it on, just like do those things, take the initiative. But I do think that a lot of these things happen in relationship to others. Writing is such a solitary thing that I think that finding ways that you can connect with other people and bringing in is like, has been really important for me, at least. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you so much. I was wondering how you came up with the idea of time space going back and forth. I found really amusing, to see, okay, Cartagena, Bogota, Miami, 1950s, this generation. So are these characters from real life? How did you get inspired for
that? Okay, we'll just use this one. So the back and forth happened. So this is the story of this like, kind of matriarchy. The narrator is 15, the mother, and then the grandmother, right? And they all live in the house. And, she's the one that's telling the story, but because you have first person, which is just right here, right? Like first person's right here, third person's a little bit over here. First person's right here. Because you only have first person, you're very much seeing them through her experience. You're getting grandma and mom through very much her experience. And I wanted to have these women have like their own lives. I was like, women are so much defined by who they're in relationship to. And I wanted the grandmother's story and the mom's story also through their teenagehood. And I wanted them not related only to Francisca's story. And so I wrote them, and some of it has to do with my mom did grow up in the 70s, and my grandmother grew up in the 50s in Cartagena. And so I was trying to imagine what it must have been like to be 15 in Cartagena without having any language for desiring and for your body and for whatever. But it was very much around being able to just have a story that was not only like these women are only in relationship to her. And I also just really like writing historical fiction. That's just, I love history. And so it was so much fun. Yes, thank you.
So you mentioned that Emmanuel is one of your influences, but I'm wondering if you have any Latinx influences that also kind of paved the way, like using Spanglish in literature.
Yeah. I remember reading Gloria and Saldúa for the first time when I was in school and being blown away because she also uses 3 languages in there. And I was just like, oh wow, this is pretty incredible. There is Elena Maria Miramontes who also does that, Janine Capó who also does that. I'm trying to think. I know that Diaz people don't like him, but I was very much influenced by The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. I just have to say that book really deeply influenced me. Yeah, and so and in Latin America, I did grow up reading a lot of Garcia Marquez when I was a kid. I have read Cien Años de Soledad probably like. I read 100 Years of Solitude for the second time, and then when I finished it, I remember finishing it and opening up again and starting all over again. Just like, okay, let's do it again. Like it was just so. I was like, it's that good. Yeah. So those are some people that have like deeply influenced me. Yeah. Oh, and Rita Indiana. Yeah. Yeah, Rita Indiana. Like the Papi is like. Rita Indiana too. Yeah. Rita Indiana is like Luis Negron, who's Puerto Rican. Yeah, Rita Indiana writes this book, Papi, and it sounds like a merengue, right? So she's like, it has this kind of like merengue beats. And I think I haven't read it in English. I know it's translated. She teaches it at NYU, I think. Maybe?
Really?
I think she teaches Spanish at NYU. But she's also a musician. And so she writes this book. And you read it, and it's like you're reading a merengue. It's kind of incredible. It's just like it has this merengue, right? It has this like merengue beats. It goes like that. Anyone else?
All right, I think that's it. Thanks again, Julián, for joining.
Thank you, everybody.